The Jetsons, Charlton, issue 15. Spacely's bored by his job when George brags that those last 3 deals he made put them ahead. At least now George has a realistic job about making deals, not just pushing one button. The Simpsons may seem less sloppy by keeping Homer's official job consistent when he's not fired, but it's far less creative and interesting by doing so, because I appreciate it when George has a different job. Spacely says his wife has to have all her teeth out, which means a short stay at the hospital, and he has to be out of town on business, so he has no one to stay with her when she comes home. George says she'll have the best of care at his house, and Spacely thanks him. I guess she'll be a terrible house guest, as otherwise it'd be boring, but I'd rather it be boring than really frustrating and annoying. George is smart enough to tell his kids in advance to keep the noise down. A nurse pushes a hovering chair with her, and 2 days later someone arrives planning to fit her for dentures. If this was an episode in the show, it would have been a lot less creative because it would have been predictable having Judy throw a party or having Judy have her noisy guitar playing friends over. Later on, she tells Spacely they look like horses' teeth. It makes no sense that she got overly big dentures. And I don't know why Spacely's calling her sweet either. The story ends with her and Spacely somehow being offended when Elroy says they are made to fit her mouth. In the next story, Judy tells Elroy they should buy their parents a present with all of their money just because it's their anniversary, and he happily agrees. I feel like this would never happen. She's nice, but Elroy's misbehaved a lot. You'd think Elroy would have been taught how to get money out of a piggy bank properly so they wouldn't have to constantly buy him a new one. Fortunately, Judy explains where she got her money, from babysitting. They don't know what to get them because they already have everything. Surprisingly, Judy has the brilliant idea to give her parents the money and tell them to do whatever they want with it because she doesn't know what to buy them. Thankfully, they appreciate it when some other people wouldn't, and Elroy shows her affection. Their parents express how grateful they are, and Jane decides to go out to dinner on Mars. George insists on ordering because he thinks he knows the Martian language, while Jane doesn't want him to make a fool out of himself. The story ends with the waiter giving him an English menu, which is a relief because I thought he'd throw food at him for saying something offensive or laugh at him. Martians never look like some toy, which is creative, but the more it does it, the more it needs to be explained, as it keeps making me wish some explained that Mars is just a melting pot of different alien species from other planets. In the next story, some toy shows Elroy a mind-a-lot that transfers thoughts into voice. Some decides to attach the helmet to Astro, and Elroy's able to understand him. It's a story only this continuity could have. It's sweet of Astro to care enough to compliment Judy's dress, even if he's got no excuse for calling her by the wrong name. I know that when I was first writing reviews for this series, occasionally I'd type down Judy instead of Jane or vice versa because they both start with J and have 4 letters. And I always thought that Jane looked like a Judy and Judy looked like a Jane. But in universe-wise, this is a dog who lives with these people 24/7. And out of universe, there's no excuse for the writers making this mistake, and the editor not catching it. George calls her Jane as well. So okay, I hope this stays consistent for the whole story, because then I'll just forgive it as a feature of this alternate universe, that she actually is called Jane. Judy thanks Astro, and then faints along with George. Elroy somehow decides to tell Sam to take the invention away, and lie to his family that he was being a ventriloquist using a book. Which isn't gonna work out because eventually one of them would ask him to demonstrate his skills. Why can't he just tell them the truth? It'd be easy to prove it. I assume his logic for giving it back is, even after his family gets used to Astro talking, he won't want everyone who hears him talk for the first time to faint as well. They should have used this device on a different dog. In the next story, George and his family head for a bus to the terraformed Venus, with Elroy somehow thinking he's allowed to visit the pilot. A hijacker makes me wonder how he ever got there. I know airport security wasn't good back in the 70s, but that's no excuse for the writers thinking that in the ideal future, it'd be so non-existent that a guy with a gun can get on a space bus. Elroy asks George if they're showing movies on this flight. You'd think he would have heard the hijacker from a mile away. Instead, he's either oblivious enough to stay cheerful or fearless because of all the different things that his family's been through, like all of the criminals George got arrested. It could be believable that a kid would think that if even an idiot like George is getting criminals arrested, they can't be very threatening. Elroy asks George for a dime to buy candy and is told not now. The hijacker somehow wastes time telling him to sit down and think of his reputation. You'd think Elroy would have seen his ray gun. I can understand why Elroy wouldn't take him seriously. What about all the other kids he's playing tag and catch with? Hopefully the writer knows why this would never happen, as the criminal says he can't believe this. But I can forgive this kind of lampshade hanging because it's meant to be a joke. This comic is funny when you're in the right mood. Like when Elroy said, "But if it's not there, how can I take it away?" Predictably, the hijacker somehow doesn't shoot anyone, which would easily get him taken seriously. And instead gives up and sits down crying. I guess he always wanted an excuse to not shoot someone. Thankfully, Elroy explains that he always knew he was a hijacker, and the fact that he says "our plans" proves that the other kids were in on it too. I always like it when one of the Jetsons foils a criminal, especially since the stories are kept short. If they lasted too long, like 8 pages, it'd feel like he was taking it too seriously. In the next story, somehow some laughter is getting transmitted from a planet's surface when sound can't travel in space. Hidden microphones and sound receivers in clothes are the only way characters in this series could hear each other there. I hope that when Jane asks what that is, it doesn't expect me to believe she can hear it, and she probably doesn't hear it because George responds that it's a small prison planet. Somehow, comedians are banished there for telling old jokes. He should say that he means comedians from alien countries with far stricter governments that stay in power no matter what, because you'd think they'd question such a strict punishment. Jane tells George to drive closer to the planet, and there's no way she'd hear the planets from so far away in an airtight car. With the way it's drawn, it makes it look like the planet is really small and the people on it are extremely small. So the planet would need a special machine or spell to keep a breathable atmosphere on it. Jane tells George to leave because they're laying eggs with jokes like that, and he says the planet is egg-shaped. But it didn't look that way until now. It has to be an artificial planet then. No wonder it's so small. People are probably hit with a shrink ray just to live there. I guess they tell the jokes because they're surrounded by people who appreciate them. So then why are they banished there for a so-called punishment, and not sent to a regular prison? George somehow gets asked if he'd like to play football with football players on the terraformed Mars, by someone who knows his name, because it doesn't explain why he and a football player are friends, and why they can just casually decide to play a casual game of football at the stadium itself. This would have made more sense if it was baseball. I doubt adults would play a game as rough as football casually. I wonder why one of them has such a ridiculous name nobody would put up with. Eventually, George gets inconvenienced and says he's not human, and gets told they're playing against robots, like in the show. Was this necessary to the story? It's interesting, but it makes it hard to buy that them tackling George is survivable. Too much of the story is a boring waste of time. It's just football, and almost nothing happens. I'm pretty sure it was more interesting in the show. George runs with a football and then runs backwards with it, getting told he made a touchdown, because they're only programmed to tackle a running man facing them. In the next story, George's old army sergeant somehow decides to visit George when it should be obvious he wouldn't be welcome there. And somehow, Jane thinks he'd be glad to get a visit from the guy who used to yell at him and order him around. And he has no excuse for doing that again. The story sucks. He doesn't let George use the dishwasher for no reason, watches TV in his armchair, and tells him something to get him to leave him alone. George knows he won't listen to reason, so he gets a plan and talks to a video phone pretending to be talking to a general. and tells him to come over and bring 2 kernels. The jerk leaves, George says he's gone, and Jane responds that here comes a general and 2 kernels. This wouldn't make sense to be George's fault, because he literally just told him to leave. He doesn't have super speed. The first story wasn't bad, but seems pointless from having nothing to do with sci-fi, no conflict either. When George agreed to let Mrs. Spacely stay at his house, I thought it'd be a cliche plot about her being an annoying house guest, so it would have sucked in the show. Instead, she never interacts with the family, giving me the impression that she just stayed in her room ignoring them the whole time. So it's a story where the characters actually had common sense. The family had the common sense to not bother her, and she had the common sense to not bother the family. So I'm glad I didn't have a bad story just because it's a sitcom. It's underwhelming that the story ends right after she complains about getting big dentures. She and her husband got offended way too easily by a well-meaning child. And I'm just wondering why she got oversized dentures when that guy would want to keep his job. Maybe that was his way of quitting. The second story has George's kids somehow decide to pool their savings and smartly give them to their parents. That was sweet, but seemed unrealistic, as I never heard of kids giving their parents an anniversary gift. And it only pretends to have something to do with sci-fi, because the Martian restaurant could have been a French restaurant. The third story is the concept of a machine that can turn thoughts into words be wasted by solely getting used to make Astro talk. And because Judy and George faint, Elroy decides to tell Sam to take it away. Fainting is usually not the reaction someone would have to a big surprise, so it seems unfair that's the only reason he gave up on letting Astro talk. And there's a lot of cartoons where a mad scientist can invent anything, even in the modern day. So any story that entirely revolves around Elroy's inventions, or Sam's inventions, doesn't really need to take place in the future. It's like how in Futurama, because it's so much like the present day, and it's all about referencing the present day, it might as well just have all of the futuristic technology be because of Farnsworth, and it could just be a world where aliens and robots are in society in the 21st century. The fourth story has a hijacker somehow make it onto a space bus, and somehow when Elroy manages to talk kids into playing tag and catch around him off screen despite his gun, he gives up with his self-esteem destroyed. So apparently the gun was only a bluff. It's a good thing it was at least explained Elroy knew he was a hijacker, because it made no sense that he wouldn't have, considering that he would have heard him. But if you replace Space Bus with Airplane, it's pretty obvious that the story has nothing to do with sci-fi. And having it take place in the future has its logic fall apart, because there's no way the hijacker would have gotten here. The fifth story has George and Jane somehow hear old jokes from a small planet from their car in space. And I have to make assumptions to get why it's so small and egg-shaped, and why the people there can be heard. It doesn't make any sense. There's such an unbelievable punishment for telling old jokes. Being banished to a planet where everyone there likes them enough that you'll keep telling them. And the only reason they would have heard them is if the jokes were being broadcast to them, and they heard them on the radio in their car. The sixth story was about George being asked to play football with football players because one knows him. Not enough of an explanation to keep the story from being so confusing that I got detached from it. But it was worth it to see him outsmart some robots. They were playing against robots who were only programmed to tackle a running man who is facing them. I guess he's only being congratulated because he wanted to feel like they won despite the robots. This technique wouldn't be allowed against robots in a real game. Most of the story was so boring I didn't care because it was normal football. The second story was a worthless and lazy one where Sergeant yells at George in his own home. And I have to assume it's because he felt like bullying him for fun because he remembered him. It's predictable as soon as he first orders him around. And while I liked George coming up with a plan to get rid of him, the final panel just had to exist, having Jane warn him about even more military men. There wasn't any sci-fi in the story. It seems like most of the comic is written by one guy, Joe Gill. But the Jetsons stories in issue 10 are by Gwen Krause. The vast majority of the time, it's impossible to know who actually wrote these stories. And with the 60s comic, it was never possible to know who wrote them. Even comics.org doesn't know for both of these comics. But this was a comic where a lot of the stories were by Gwen Krauss.